In 1945, as Berlin burned around him, Adolf Hitler made a terrifying accusation against the one man he had trusted most with his life. "You've been poisoning me," he screamed, before banishing his personal physician forever. But the truth was far more disturbing than Hitler realized. For nearly a decade, this doctor hadn't been poisoning the dictator. He had been feeding an addiction that may have changed the course of human history. This is the story of Theodor Morell, the man who turned the world's most dangerous leader into a drug addict. Theodor Morell's path to infamy began in the most ordinary way possible. Born on July 22, 1886, in the village of Traismunzenberg in the Upper Hessen region of west-central Germany, young Theodor suffered from the same stomach ailments that would later make him indispensable to Adolf Hitler. It was this childhood pain that drove him toward medicine, a cruel irony that would echo through history. His father Karl was a primary school teacher, while his mother, Elisa Margaretha, came from a quite affluent family of the region. The Morells were comfortable as a result. Theodor had an older brother named Adolf and a younger sister named Emily. The early years were unremarkable, except for one crucial detail. The stomach cramps that plagued him forced him out of traditional schooling and into home education. This early experience with illness would shape everything that followed. When he finally attended secondary school, Theodor excelled beyond expectations. His performance was so outstanding that he was excused from taking oral examinations. His year-long work spoke for itself. This academic brilliance opened every door, yet his first choice wasn't medicine. Instead, he headed to Friedberg to train as a teacher, following in his father's footsteps. By age 19, he had completed his teaching degree and spent a year instructing students near Mainz. But teaching couldn't contain his ambitions. The classroom felt too small for someone who had tasted academic excellence. He abandoned education for medicine, eventually landing at Heidelberg University, one of Germany's most prestigious institutions. When he graduated in 1909 at 23, his professors noted his excellence in everything except chemistry and zoology, subjects that would later prove irrelevant to his unconventional medical practices. Morell's hunger for knowledge drove him beyond Germany's borders. He studied in Grenoble and Paris, absorbing French medical techniques that would later distinguish his practice. Back in Germany, he took various positions, working with an immunologist, gaining experience in an ear clinic, while simultaneously pursuing his doctorate in gynecology in Munich. By 1913, still short of his 27th birthday, he had earned both his doctorate and his medical license. The achievement was impressive, his academic record spotless, his references glowing. Every indication pointed toward a conventional, successful medical career. But convention would never satisfy Theodor Morell. His movements after graduation remain mysterious. Rather than establishing a traditional practice, he signed up as a ship's doctor with the Warman-Linie, traveling between Europe and Africa. Later, he switched to the North German Lloyd-Linie, voyaging between Hamburg and South America. These journeys would last only 8 or 9 months, but in later years, Morell would claim his experimental treatments derived from exotic folk medicines encountered during these travels. This was almost certainly fabrication. The brief port visits would have provided no real opportunity to study local medical practices. Instead, this appears to have been Morell's first attempt at creating a mystique around his methods, suggesting ancient wisdom where there was only ambition and imagination. The outbreak of World War I ended his overseas adventures as the British Royal Navy took control of the Atlantic. Like millions of other Germans, Morell was conscripted into the Imperial Army. His medical background meant assignment as a medic, serving in a field hospital on the Western Front in France in 1917. Toward the war's end, He was relocated to a prison hospital for POWs in Germany, serving as camp physician. As Germany descended into revolution and defeat, Morell headed for Berlin. He had acquired enough money to purchase an existing medical practice, the foundation for everything that would follow. Morell's life transformed completely after the war ended. He met and married Johanna Mahler, an actress from a wealthy family. They would never have children, but Johanna's family wealth provided the funding Theodor needed to pursue his growing interest in experimental medicine. Whether this interest had truly developed during his brief time as a ship's doctor remains debatable, but in 1920s Berlin, alternative medicine had found fertile ground. Morell developed his office with cutting-edge medical equipment designed to impress wealthy patients. His treatments became increasingly unconventional, peculiar concoctions ranging from plant extracts to enzymes to bile. Much of this bordered on quackery, but not all of it was completely bogus. Morell placed heavy emphasis on boosting the immune system through high-dose vitamin injections. In an era before vitamin supplements were commonplace, this was genuinely innovative and often effective, especially for patients recovering from illness who were vitamin deficient. Whatever the medical merits of his other substances, patients were convinced. The King of Romania and the Shah of Persia petitioned unsuccessfully for Morell to become their personal physician. Actors and singers filled his patient roster, many drawn through his wife's connections in Berlin's entertainment world. The practice flourished. By the early 1930s, he was earning about 150,000 Reichsmarks annually, a very prosperous income. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression changed everything. The economic downturn hit Germany particularly hard, as the country struggled to maintain war reparations payments while suffering through the crisis. The collapse was elongated in Germany, with a devastating second phase beginning in summer 1931 after the near-complete collapse of Kreditanstalt Bank in Vienna. Financial contagion spread across Central Europe, facilitating the rise of extremist political parties like the National Socialist German Workers' Party. There is no evidence that Morell had special interest in political matters, and his personal views remain largely mysterious. However, he joined the Nazi Party in 1933 after they came to power. This wasn't unusual. Hundreds of thousands of Germans made the same pragmatic decision, believing party membership could benefit their careers. In Morell's case, the decision might also have been connected to his past activities. Many of his patients had been people of Jewish heritage, and there was even some possibility that Morell himself had limited Jewish ancestry, though this was never fully substantiated. Whatever his motivation, Morell joined the Nazis purely as a precautionary measure. He made no attempt to engage with party activities or climb its hierarchy. Like many Germans, he simply found it safer to appear loyal than risk suspicion from the new regime. In spring 1936, Morell's life changed forever. Through friends in the German film industry, he was introduced to Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer. Hoffmann was an alcoholic with mounting health problems caused by his drinking habits and alcohol-related obesity. Morell was discreet in his official notes, referring to Hoffmann's condition as hemorrhoids, when in reality he was treating him for gonorrhea, a sexually transmitted disease. Hoffmann was already becoming wealthy through his monopoly on distributing Hitler's image. He paid Morell handsomely to come to Munich and treat him personally for several weeks. During this treatment period, at a gathering in Hoffmann's mansion in the Bogenhausen suburb of Munich, Morell was introduced to Adolf Hitler. This initial social meeting quickly evolved into a professional relationship. Toward the end of Morell's time treating Hoffmann, the photographer reported to Hitler that he had noticed significant improvement in his health. Hitler was sufficiently impressed to begin consulting with Morell himself. At this stage, the dictator wasn't in the terrible health that would plague his final years, but he was suffering from ailments that his other doctors had failed to resolve, notably persistent stomach cramps and a severe rash. This was how Theodor Morell became personal physician to Adolf Hitler. Morell was not a senior Nazi official of any kind, and we would have little information about his actions had he not kept a detailed diary, not of his daily thoughts, but a careful log of his treatment of Hitler, whom he termed patient A. He recorded meetings with Hitler, the Nazi leader's symptoms and ailments, and what he prescribed to treat the growing array of disorders Hitler suffered from. Interestingly, this diary wasn't kept from 1936 onward. Morell only began maintaining these detailed records in August 1941, following Hitler's sudden illness during the early stages of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The dictator's declining health had left him debilitated at a crucial military moment, and Morell evidently wanted precise documentation of his treatments. The diary was maintained for the next 3.5 years, providing invaluable insight into Hitler's deteriorating condition and the growing cocktail of drugs Morell was administering. The diary barely survived the war, shipped from Berlin in crates to a facility at Bad Reichenhall in southern Germany, where Dr. Riedel ran a business on Morell's behalf. The crates were buried beside a wall in the war's final stages. They might have remained there permanently if Riedel hadn't revealed their location to American soldiers in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The diary was then sent to America, spending 4 decades in storage in Washington, D.C., before finally being published in 1983. Morell's revelations have only been widely available since the mid-1980s. The man Morell termed patient A wasn't in terrible health when he first became Hitler's doctor in 1936. The Nazi dictator was still in his mid-40s, with typical middle-aged ailments plus the stomach cramps and rash. Early on, Morell prescribed probiotics and other tonics he had devised. The stomach cramps were relieved, and the leg rash cleared up. Whether this was coincidence or genuine treatment effectiveness remains unclear, but a probiotic can indeed help clear up certain rashes. Morell's use of probiotics was novel for the time, reinforcing Hitler's belief that his new doctor was more capable than traditional physicians who favored conventional methods. Hitler was also something of a hypochondriac with unusual personal habits, so Morell's unconventional approach complemented the dictator's own perspective on health matters. The problem was that Hitler's health began declining right around the time Morell entered his orbit. There's no single clear explanation for what ailed him. He was most likely suffering from Parkinson's disease, which would explain the hand tremor that developed and worsened over the years. Huntington's disease was another possibility. Some theorized he suffered from syphilis, though there's no concrete evidence for this. Parkinson's remains the most likely explanation, soon compounded by other issues that developed after World War II began. As his health deteriorated, Hitler placed increasing faith in Morell. However, rather than treating underlying conditions, Morell's approach would make the health problems worse over time. He was effectively drugging Hitler rather than healing him. Morell wasn't Hitler's only doctor. As health problems multiplied, the dictator recruited a team of physicians trying different approaches. The most prominent was Karl Brandt, a young doctor who had studied under well-known physicians and surgeons before being hired by Hitler in 1934 as his personal physician, having first met him in 1932. Brandt was only 30 when he joined Hitler's staff. Morell and Brandt clashed instantly. Morell viewed Brandt as a young upstart, while Brandt was among the first to suspect that Morell's alternative treatments were not just ineffective but potentially harmful. He also questioned Morell's ideological loyalty. Brandt was a committed Nazi who had joined the party before they seized power and would later become involved in the Action T4 program, a campaign of involuntary mass euthanasia in German hospitals and prisons. Brandt brought surgeon Hans Karl von Hasselbach to contribute intermittently to Hitler's medical team. Another doctor who joined later was Erwin Giesing, an ear, nose, and throat specialist considerably younger than Morell. Giesing had joined the Nazi Party in 1932 and occasionally treated Hitler for specific ailments, being called upon frequently when Hitler suffered ear and eye injuries toward the war's end. Unlike Brandt, Giesing shared one crucial trait with Morell. Both were great believers in the efficacy of Class A drugs for treating various ailments. This wasn't entirely unusual. Certain narcotics are still widely used in medical settings today as local anesthetics, particularly in ear, nose, and throat surgery. Both Giesing and Morell would administer growing amounts of drugs to Hitler as the war progressed. Patient A liked the effects. He remarked occasionally that the drugs had worked very well. When there was little medical need, the doctors continued administering them because Hitler responded positively. As Morell seemingly treated Hitler's ailments effectively and won his trust, a friendship developed between them. Hitler enjoyed Morell's company, though most other leading Nazis found his presence in the Führer's inner circle perplexing. The dictator would often visit the Morell household in Berlin, occasionally appearing unexpectedly for Sunday tea before the war made such visits impossible. Even after Europe was at war, he managed this once or twice. When Theodor's wife could only provide spaghetti and cheese, Hitler ordered his assistant to supply them with ration coupons, a peculiar exchange, as the Morells hardly needed them. By then, Theodor was a millionaire in modern terms, having exploited his ties to Nazi leadership. Hitler enjoyed Frau Morell's almond cakes and would request them regularly. This close relationship extended to Theodor regularly appearing in photographs that Hoffmann would take of Hitler. As time passed, the doctor became a nearly permanent presence at Hitler's side. Few individuals spent more time in close proximity to the dictator. This became troublesome for Morell in some ways, requiring extensive travel. He spent much of the 3 years between summer 1941 and summer 1944 on the Eastern Front at the Wolfslair headquarters with Hitler and his military staff. Very often he attended late-night gatherings where Hitler, who stayed awake until dawn and rose around midday, would drone on about trains and other random topics until the early hours. Morell played a peculiar role in the process whereby Hitler and the Nazis pulled the continent toward war in 1938 and 1939. The Anschluss with Austria was completed in March 1938. Hitler immediately turned attention to Czechoslovakia, a country formed after World War I that included the Sudetenland, an area populated by German-speaking people of largely German ethnicity. He prevailed upon Britain, France, and Italy to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland at the Munich Conference in September 1938. This proved merely a stepping stone to full incorporation of the country into the Third Reich. In March 1939, Germany prepared to invade Czechoslovakia. With German army divisions massing on the border, Slovakia and Ruthenia seceded from their union with the Czech parts of the country and indicated they would accept German rule. In response, Czechoslovakia's president Emil Hacha flew to Berlin to negotiate with Hitler. During several meetings on March 14, 1939, with German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, Air Force head Hermann Göring, and Hitler himself, Hacha was threatened with invasion if he didn't agree to his country's annexation. Göring claimed he would bomb Prague to the ground if Hacha didn't capitulate. The Czech president was even chased around a table with papers signing away Czechoslovakia's independence being waved at him to sign. Hacha, in his mid-60s, suffered what was probably a heart attack during this process. Morell was called in to inject him with stimulants. With the doctor's drugs entering his system, Hacha was sufficiently revived to sign the papers. German forces entered Czechoslovakia the next day. The Hacha incident highlights how Morell functioned as a physician on demand within Nazi leadership. Though his position was best described as Hitler's personal doctor, and he had largely stopped running his private Berlin practice, he did see other patients in the Nazi Party's upper echelons. Interestingly, these were often situations where various Nazi ministers and officials were advised by Hitler to see Morell about health issues. Nearly all individuals who went to see Morell in this capacity formed negative impressions of him. Göring disparagingly called him the Meisterjabber because Morell's solution for every ailment was to inject the patient with one substance or another. Not long after he started attending to Hitler's health issues, Morell was visited by Albert Speer, the Nazi architect who later became minister for the war economy. Speer was suffering from gastrointestinal issues, and Hitler recommended he visit Morell. There he was prescribed bizarre tablets containing a cocktail of vitamins, hormones, bile, and intestinal bacteria. Suspecting something was amiss, Speer sought another opinion from a specialist, who advised he simply needed rest. Speer's symptoms soon abated without Morell's pills. The list of those who viewed Morell as a quack grew, including propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, von Ribbentrop, and many others. Still, almost everyone Hitler recommended the doctor to appease the Führer by meeting with him. Morell even treated Neville Chamberlain for flu symptoms at the Munich Conference in 1938 and tended to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini during another diplomatic conference. Things changed dramatically in autumn 1939. After pressuring Hacha to allow Czechoslovakia's annexation, German leadership immediately turned eastward to Poland. Large portions had been controlled by Germany before World War I defeat, and peace terms had ensured East Prussia was geographically cut off from the rest of Germany by the Danzig corridor of Polish land. These and other claims formed the basis for German demands that Poland cede territory. By then, Britain and France were no longer engaging in diplomacy with Hitler, instead trying to rearm and mobilize before inevitable war. When Poland was invaded on September 1, 1939, the British and French declared war on Germany. The conflict would drive Morell closer to Hitler as the Nazi leader's health declined, and he became ever more dependent on Morell, much to his detriment. Meanwhile, Morell's own health was declining. At a dinner party in the war's first winter, he suffered what was probably a heart attack, falling over and hitting his head on furniture. These coronary issues were exacerbated by his obesity and worsened as the war continued. By 1942, he was suffering regular angina attacks. On one or two occasions, he was so incapacitated by chest spasms that his assistant doctor had to attend to Hitler, though he tried to disguise his own health problems where possible. The war provided opportunities for Morell to make substantial money. Many figures in Hitler's inner circle exploited their proximity to the Führer financially. Heinrich Hoffmann, for instance, had a virtual monopoly on reproducing the Nazi leader's image, licensing it for everything from postage stamps to postcards, becoming a millionaire in the process. Morell did something similar. His trusted position among Hitler's medical team meant he could convince the Führer to give him contracts supplying the German army and wider society with his potions and pills. Several were actually ahead of their time. Mutaflor contained live bacteria similar to those found in many modern health drinks, but rare when Morell began selling them. Others were much more nefarious. Vitamultin was a mix of vitamins, glucose, and depending on the version, methamphetamine. The methamphetamine was derived from another drug being distributed to the German army during the war, Pervitin. Pervitin was basically methamphetamine in pill form, with little disguising this fact. Much of the German blitzkrieg in the early war years was achieved through drug use, as soldiers in tank divisions stayed awake for days on the narcotic. Morell was simply including in Vitamultin the substance already available in pharmacies, trademarked as Pervitin in Germany. Many people liked it, and Morell started making serious money, an estimated 6 million Reichsmarks, making him a multi-millionaire in modern terms. The drug had peculiar fans. Marshal Ion Antonescu, Romania's dictator, tried it once and wrote to Morell requesting more. In both his case and Hitler's, it's debatable whether they actually knew what they were taking. As the war progressed and his business empire expanded, Morell became increasingly mobile. For the first 3 years serving as Hitler's physician, he had split time broadly between Berlin and Bavaria, where Hitler often spent time in Munich and at his Alpine retreat near the Austrian border. Once war started, his habits changed significantly. In October 1939, after Poland's conquest was completed, he visited Warsaw to review troops and attend a victory parade. In summer 1940, he embarked on a victory visit to Paris after France's fall, and 4 months later headed to the country's far south for a diplomatic meeting with General Francisco Franco of Spain. In 1941, he visited Croatia and the front in Ukraine and Latvia. Morell was generally always nearby, ready to provide whatever drugs might be needed. The war on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union from June 1941 lent some stability to the situation. Hitler had ordered establishment of a bomb-proof headquarters in forests near Gierlaus in Poland to serve as his base of operations, being closer to front lines than Berlin. He moved in with a small army of officials as Operation Barbarossa began against the Soviets in Eastern Europe. Morell spent much of his life between summer 1941 and late 1944 living there. His quarters were about 250 yards from Hitler's. Only Hitler's personal secretary, Martin Bormann, was closer, while Morell was notably housed alongside generals and senior military men like Göring and Wehrmacht head Wilhelm Keitel, a sign of how close Hitler wanted him to be. As the war continued, Morell resorted to an ever larger number of pills and a worrying number of injections to treat Hitler. Many substances reflected that Morell was something of a quack doctor who had for years sold remedies with no scientific basis in medicine. One concoction he called U-flat was a mix of bile extract, caffeine, various aloes, pancreatine, and radix angelica, a dried root used in traditional Chinese medicine. Others involved high doses of vitamins. These were on the more benign end of Morell's medicines. The vitamins and caffeine would have at least ensured Hitler didn't have vitamin deficiencies and was more alert. Others were very peculiar. Morell gave Hitler a substance called orchicrin, a strange mix of bovine testosterone, glycerol phosphates, and pituitary gland made into a tonic. As unpleasant as these sound, there's nothing suggesting they would have negatively impacted Hitler's health. The same cannot be said of the harder narcotics Morell was giving Hitler more frequently in the early 1940s. These included amphetamines such as Pervitin or in the form of his own Vitamultin. Morell also commonly prescribed Hitler other Class A drugs, initially justified to treat an ocular issue with his eyes. It escalated, and soon Morell was administering them regularly. We might assume Hitler was aware these drugs were affecting him, but he seems to have overlooked the narcotic effect as Morell's injections and pills gave him the energy to work long days throughout the war. At night, Morell would then administer sleeping pills and tranquilizers so Hitler could sleep. The late-night roundtables, where Hitler would talk at length about random subjects to followers until nearly dawn, can be viewed in fresh perspective when we consider he was probably high and then experiencing the sedative qualities of sleeping pills. In early summer 1942, Morell played a role in the most high-profile assassination of a senior Nazi during the entire Second World War. Reinhard Heydrich had worked his way up through the SS and SD, the Reich Security Services, in the mid-1930s, eventually becoming de facto second-in-command of the SS under Heinrich Himmler and overseeing a huge proportion of Reich security and police services. He had operational oversight for organizing large parts of the Holocaust. In autumn 1941, Hitler appointed him interim protector or governor of Bohemia and Moravia, the Rump-occupied state of Czechoslovakia. Heydrich's conduct there was controversial, engaging in crackdowns on Czech resistance groups. This earned widespread enmity, and on May 27, 1942, while driving in an open-top car near Prague, he was attacked and badly wounded by Czech resistance fighters. He wasn't killed initially and was taken to Bělovka Hospital in Prague, where emergency surgery was performed. He remained critical for days thereafter, and Morell was flown in to consult with several other doctors on Hitler's orders. While Morell's methods and conduct as a physician are otherwise questionable in almost everything else he did, in Heydrich's case he seems to have offered good advice. He proposed giving Heydrich sulfanilamide, an antibacterial drug relatively new at the time. The other physicians at the hospital didn't heed his advice. The suspicion later was that possible gangrene onset contributed to Heydrich's eventual death on June 4th, though gunshot wounds were paramount. Heydrich's demise was symptomatic of the wider shift in war during 1942. The German onslaught on the Soviet Union in late summer and autumn 1941 was every bit as swift and brutal as it had been in Western Europe a year earlier. In Operation Barbarossa's first weeks alone, hundreds of kilometers of terry. But maintaining German blitzkrieg speed from Poland to Moscow was entirely different from the distance to Paris. Eventually, the German advance slowed and stalled short of Moscow and Leningrad in early winter. Shortly after, Americans entered the war, and it became a grind on the Eastern Front to see if Germans could simply wear Russians down in 1942. They couldn't, and soon counterattacks were being planned for 1943. As the war shifted dramatically and it became clear Germans were in dire trouble, Hitler's health deteriorated and Morell increased his injections. One diary entry is instructive. On March 24, 1943, they were at the Berghof Alpine retreat when Hitler called Morell to him at about 9:30 p.m. He took his blood pressure, which was extremely high at 170 systolic. Morell put an exclamation mark after this to indicate his shock, although Hitler consistently had abnormally elevated blood pressure by that time. Having taken blood pressure, the doctor gave patient A 2 intravenous shots of 10 cubic centimeters Septoid, 2 tablespoons of bromnervicet, and an optaladin tablet. The Septoid injections were a mixture of glucose and iodine. The optaladin was basically caffeine and paracetamol. However, when Morell noted this in his diary, it usually meant he was also giving Hitler Vitamultin, which contained methamphetamine. To counteract the amphetamine, glucose, and caffeine, the bromnervicet was essentially a strong tranquilizer. A novel element crept into Morell's treatment of Hitler shortly after this. Hitler was suffering from acute gastrointestinal issues in summer 1943. Most responsible physicians might consider that the often bizarre cocktail of enzymes, bile, hormones, glucose, methamphetamine, and dozens of other substances Morell was giving him might have been causing the issue and might have advised cutting back. For Morell, the solution was adding something new to the mix. In his entry for July 18, 1943, he noted that he injected upavarin intravenously and Eucadol subcutaneously, gave him Euflat and Lutzim, stomach massage and diet, spastic constipation with violent pain, and a lot of intestinal gas. Several of these were Morell's concoctions. The Lutzim, for instance, consisted of enzymes, amylase, and proteases. But the Eucadol is quite significant. This was a powerful opiate, today notoriously known as oxycodone. Long before it was marketed as OxyContin, oxycodone had first been synthesized by doctors at the University of Frankfurt in 1916. The version Morell gave Hitler in summer 1943 was mixed with ephedrine and scopolamine, the latter being an alkaloid used to treat motion sickness. Evidently, it was effective, as Morell resorted to it with greater frequency in months that followed. The motives for resorting to this powerful opiate were often quite flimsy. On January 9, 1944, he gave patient A an injection of Eucadol because of flatulence caused by worry. All these injections, whether of Eucadol or the many other narcotics and substances Morell administered, were beginning to take a toll on the Nazi leader's circulatory system. There are entries noting Hitler's veins were bleeding, and one entry concerning Eucadol notes he injected him in the stomach. By 1943, many people who saw Hitler regularly at the Wolf's Lair or in Berlin and had noticed his physical decline over the years were concerned about Morell's methods. One senior minister decided to confront Morell directly. In summer 1943, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop invited Morell to lunch. The pair were hardly friends, and Morell was suspicious about the invitation's purpose. They sat through lunch, and only after eating did von Ribbentrop reveal why he had wished to meet Morell. He was concerned about how Hitler was being treated. What, von Ribbentrop asked him, was in these mysterious injections he regularly gave the Nazi leader? It was surely more than glucose and vitamins, as Morell would often suggest to those familiar with his regular injections of Hitler. Morell, aware he enjoyed Hitler's confidence more than von Ribbentrop did, answered evasively that he simply gave Hitler what he needed on a given day. He left shortly afterward. There was a peculiar element to this. Von Ribbentrop was himself treated, along with SS head Heinrich Himmler, by Felix Kirsten, a faith healer whose methods were just as dubious as Morell's. There's no doubt von Ribbentrop had seen through Morell and, unlike so many others in Hitler's inner circle, was willing to confront the doctor by summer 1943 about his methods. The intervention had no tangible impact, though Morell was rattled enough by the confrontation to write a detailed account of it. Far from leading to any decline in Morell's influence, 1944 saw him reach the peak of his hold over Hitler. The Nazi state's leader was in very bad condition. It was as though his physical state reflected the declining German war effort. As news of fresh defeats by Soviets on the Eastern Front continued through 1943 and 1944, then word arrived of a Southern Front opening in Sicily in summer 1943, followed by D-Day landings in France a year later. Hitler became increasingly ill, his hands shaking and frame stooped. A large number of German politicians and military commanders kept detailed diaries during these years, and several recorded being shocked at Hitler's physical decline during this period, especially if they hadn't seen him for several months. All of this was compounded by events of July 20, 1944. A group of army officers led by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg conspired to place a briefcase full of explosives near Hitler during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair, then planned to seize government control once the Führer was dead. The explosives did detonate, but the briefcase had been moved and didn't explode where it should have. Several people were killed. Hitler was only wounded but did suffer increased health complications in weeks that followed. His trusty Dr. Morell, of course, had the solution: more drugs. There was notable increase in Morell's prescriptions at this point, particularly of Ukedal. Additionally, there seems to have been a double prescription issue as well. Morell was giving Hitler strong narcotics to deal with his injuries at the same time one of his other physicians, Giesing, was also administering Class A drugs. There's no doubt substantial amounts of these drugs were being administered. On October 30th, 1944, Morell noted in his diary that he had given Hitler an injection of Ukedal, which he noted was by no means easy because of the many recent needle scars. Right around this time, Morell's methods were called into question again. Dr. Erwin Giesing was only an occasional member of Hitler's medical team, but was present at the Wolf's Lair for an extended period following the July 20th plot due to Hitler's injuries. In weeks that followed, he became suspicious of Morell's methods and eventually obtained some pills he was giving Hitler for gastrointestinal problems. He discovered strychnine present in these pills. Today this is used as a pesticide and understood to be highly toxic for humans, causing a form of poisoning and muscular contractions. It was used in the early 20th century in very small doses as a performance enhancer because it stimulated muscles. By World War II, it was well known to be toxic. The amount Morell was administering was small, but the frequency with which he gave these pills to Hitler was such that it would have built up in his system. Accordingly, Giesing and several others confronted Morell and brought this to Hitler's attention. When they did, the dictator responded violently and had Giesing, von Hasselbach, and Brandt dismissed. Hitler's response, if Morell's diary is to be believed, indicates the striking manner in which patient A was beholden to Morell. After the effort to bring him down failed, Hitler said to Morell of the other doctors, "The idiots never paused for a moment to think of the harm they would have been doing to me. I would have found myself all of a sudden without a doctor. And these people ought to realize that you have saved my life several times in the 8 years you have been with me. Look how I was before." Every single one of the doctors who was dragged in failed. When commending Morell's treatment, Hitler went on to say that if they both survived the war, he would reward him handsomely afterward. This was ironic. The diary entry is under November 8, 1944. Right after this, Morell took leave to return to Germany for his brother Adolf's funeral. When he returned to the Wolf's Lair, he met with Hitler and found him extremely irritable and impatient, noting in his diary that he had never been spoken to by him in the same way in the 8 years he had been treating him. Hitler's irritability was undoubtedly owing to the military situation. But maintaining German blitzkrieg speed from Poland to Moscow was entirely different from the distance to Paris. Eventually, the German advance slowed and stalled short of Moscow and Leningrad in early winter. Shortly after, Americans entered the war, and it became a grind on the Eastern Front to see if Germans could simply wear Russians down in 1942. They couldn't, and soon counterattacks were being planned for 1943. As the war shifted dramatically, and it became clear Germans were in dire trouble, Hitler's health deteriorated and Morell increased his injections. One diary entry is instructive. On March 24, 1943, they were at the Berghof Alpine retreat when Hitler called Morell to him at about 9:30 p.m. He took his blood pressure, which was extremely high at 170 systolic. Morell put an exclamation mark after this to indicate his shock, although Hitler consistently had abnormally elevated blood pressure by that time. Having taken blood pressure, the doctor gave patient A 2 intravenous shots of 10 cubic centimeters Septoid, 2 tablespoons of bromnervicet, and an optaladin tablet. The Septoid injections were a mixture of glucose and iodine. The optaladin was basically caffeine and paracetamol. However, when Morell noted this in his diary, it usually meant he was also giving Hitler Vitamultin, which contained methamphetamine. To counteract the amphetamine, glucose, and caffeine, the bromnervicet was essentially a strong tranquilizer. A novel element crept into Morell's treatment of Hitler shortly after this. Hitler was suffering from acute gastrointestinal issues in summer 1943. Most responsible physicians might consider that the often bizarre cocktail of enzymes, bile, hormones, glucose, methamphetamine, and dozens of other substances Morell was giving him might have been causing the issue and might have advised cutting back. For Morell, the solution was adding something new to the mix. In his entry for July 18, 1943, He noted that he injected upavarin intravenously and Eucadol subcutaneously, gave him Euflat and Lutzim, stomach massage and diet, spastic constipation with violent pain, and a lot of intestinal gas. Several of these were Morell's concoctions. The Lutzim, for instance, consisted of enzymes, amylase, and proteases. But the Eucadol is quite significant. This was a powerful opiate, today notoriously known as oxycodone. Long before it was marketed as OxyContin, oxycodone had first been synthesized by doctors at the University of Frankfurt in 1916. The version Morell gave Hitler in summer 1943 was mixed with ephedrine and scopolamine, the latter being an alkaloid used to treat motion sickness. Evidently, it was effective, as Morell resorted to it with greater frequency in months that followed. The motives for resorting to this powerful opiate were often quite flimsy. On January 9, 1944, he gave patient A an injection of Eucadol because of flatulence caused by worry. All these injections, whether of Eucadol or the many other narcotics and substances Morell administered, were beginning to take a toll on the Nazi leader's circulatory system. There are entries noting Hitler's veins were bleeding, and one entry concerning Eucadol notes he injected him in the stomach. By 1943, many people who saw Hitler regularly at the Wolf's Lair or in Berlin and had noticed his physical decline over the years were concerned about Morell's methods. One senior minister decided to confront Morell directly. In summer 1943, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop invited Morell to lunch. The pair were hardly friends, and Morell was suspicious about the invitation's purpose. They sat through lunch, and only after eating did von Ribbentrop reveal why he had wished to meet Morell. He was concerned about how Hitler was being treated. What, von Ribbentrop asked him, was in these mysterious injections he regularly gave the Nazi leader? It was surely more than glucose and vitamins, as Morell would often suggest to those familiar with his regular injections of Hitler. Morell, aware he enjoyed Hitler's confidence more than von Ribbentrop did, answered evasively that he simply gave Hitler what he needed on a given day. He left shortly afterward. There was a peculiar element to this. Von Ribbentrop was himself treated, along with SS head Heinrich Himmler, by Felix Kirsten, a faith healer whose methods were just as dubious as Morell's. There's no doubt von Ribbentrop had seen through Morell and, unlike so many others in Hitler's inner circle, was willing to confront the doctor by summer 1943 about his methods. The intervention had no tangible impact, though Morell was rattled enough by the confrontation to write a detailed account of it. Far from leading to any decline in Morell's influence, 1944 saw him reach the peak of his hold over Hitler. The Nazi state's leader was in very bad condition. It was as though his physical state reflected the declining German war effort. As news of fresh defeats by Soviets on the Eastern Front continued through 1943 and 1944, then word arrived of a Southern Front opening in Sicily in summer 1943, followed by D-Day landings in France a year later. Hitler became increasingly ill, his hands shaking and frame stooped. A large number of German politicians and military commanders kept detailed diaries during these years, and several recorded being shocked at Hitler's physical decline during this period, especially if they hadn't seen him for several months. All of this was compounded by events of July 20, 1944. A group of army officers led by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg conspired to place a briefcase full of explosives near Hitler during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair, then planned to seize government control once the Führer was dead. The explosives did detonate, but the briefcase had been moved and didn't explode where it should have. Several people were killed. Hitler was only wounded but did suffer increased health complications in weeks that followed. His trusty Dr. Morell, of course, had the solution: more drugs. There was notable increase in Morell's prescriptions at this point, particularly of Eucadol. Additionally, there seems to have been a double prescription issue as well. Morell was giving Hitler strong narcotics to deal with his injuries at the same time one of his other physicians, Giesing, was also administering Class A drugs. There's no doubt substantial amounts of these drugs were being administered. On October 30, 1944, Morell noted in his diary that he had given Hitler an injection of Eucadol, which he noted was by no means easy because of the many recent needle scars. Right around this time, Morell's methods were called into question again. Dr. Erwin Giesing was only an occasional member of Hitler's medical team, but was present at the Wolf's Lair for an extended period following the July 20th plot due to Hitler's injuries. In weeks that followed, he became suspicious of Morell's methods and eventually obtained some pills he was giving Hitler for gastrointestinal problems. He discovered strychnine present in these pills. Today this is used as a pesticide and understood to be highly toxic for humans, causing a form of poisoning and muscular contractions. It was used in the early 20th century in very small doses as a performance enhancer because it stimulated muscles. By World War II, it was well known to be toxic. The amount Morell was administering was small, but the frequency with which he gave these pills to Hitler was such that it would have built up in his system. Accordingly, Giesing and several others confronted Morell and brought this to Hitler's attention. When they did, the dictator responded violently and had Giesing, von Hasselbach, and Brandt dismissed. Hitler's response, if Morell's diary is to be believed, indicates the striking manner in which patient A was beholden to Morell. After the effort to bring him down failed, Hitler said to Morell of the other doctors, "The idiots never paused for a moment to think of the harm they would have been doing to me. I would have found myself all of a sudden without a doctor. And these people ought to realize that you have saved my life several times in the 8 years you have been with me. Look how I was before." Every single one of the doctors who was dragged in failed. When commending Morell's treatment, Hitler went on to say that if they both survived the war, he would reward him handsomely afterward. This was ironic. The diary entry is under November 8, 1944. Right after this, Morell took leave to return to Germany for his brother Adolf's funeral. When he returned to the Wolf's Lair, he met with Hitler and found him extremely irritable and impatient, noting in his diary that he had never been spoken to by him in the same way in the 8 years he had been treating him. Hitler's irritability was undoubtedly owing to the military situation. Already by summer 1944, the Soviets had been advancing all along the Eastern Front. In some locations such as south of Leningrad into Estonia, progress was very slow, but in Ukraine they were advancing at great speed and by autumn 1944 were pushing into the Balkans. Then the D-Day landings took place in northern France in summer 1944, and suddenly the Nazis had to contend with 3 different fronts. One in Eastern Europe, one in Western Europe, and one that had already been opened in Italy in autumn 1943. Then Hitler took the decision to launch a last-ditch counteroffensive against the Western Allies in the Ardennes forest around Luxembourg in winter 1944. With troops being pulled away from the Eastern Front, the Soviet advance accelerated again into Poland. By November 1944, consideration was being given to when Hitler and his staff would leave the Wolf's Lair and head to Berlin. Although the headquarters would not be fully abandoned until January 1945, Hitler, Morell, and the core staff around the Nazi leader left on November 20, 1944. Henceforth, they would be based out of the Reich Chancellery offices in central Berlin. Life in the Reich Chancellery and surrounding buildings in central Berlin had a strange, apocalyptic quality in the months that followed. Everyone knew the war was over and defeat was imminent. The only hope Hitler and other Nazi leaders clung to was that as victory neared, the Americans, British, and other Western allies would suddenly realize the Soviets were a much graver threat and would seek to ally with the Nazis against communism. When this fantasy failed to materialize, Hitler became increasingly erratic and paranoid according to Morell's diary entries. The doctor continued administering his cocktail of injections to patient A, though by then supply shortages were creeping into every aspect of life in what remained of the Third Reich. There was a slight shift in what Morell was prescribing, notably an increase in calcium injections and a growing reliance on whatever pharmaceutical supplies could still be obtained. Morell's own health was deteriorating rapidly during this period. His coronary problems, exacerbated by years of obesity and stress, were becoming more frequent and severe. At one point he botched giving himself an injection and was bedridden for several days. His hands, once steady enough to perform delicate medical procedures, now shook almost as badly as Hitler's. On March 23, 1945, Morell's diary entry painted a devastating picture of Hitler's physical condition. The Führer's conjunctivitis was caused by dust from bombed buildings in the Chancellery courtyard. He declared he had only very limited vision in his right eye. His left hand was grotesquely swollen from constant trembling, and there were matching swellings on his left ankle and lower leg, the circumference an inch larger than the right side. Morell applied cocaine eye drops and forbade Hitler from reading. At midday, he injected strofantin and Minerva Forte intravenously, plus Omnidin, followed by electrotherapy on the left forearm. The clinical detachment of these notes masked the horror of what they described. The leader of the Third Reich had become a physical wreck, held together only by a daily regimen of powerful drugs administered by a doctor whose own body was failing. The Battle of Berlin began in earnest in mid-April 1945. For weeks, the Soviet Red Army had been positioning itself around the German capital, methodically encircling the city and preparing for the final assault. The irony was bitter. The same encirclement tactics the German Wehrmacht had used with devastating effect against the Red Army in 1941 were now being turned against Berlin itself. Inside the Chancellery bunker, Hitler's behavior became increasingly unhinged as the sounds of battle grew closer each day. His rage at Germany's military situation reached new heights. He blamed his generals with psychotic fury, convinced that treachery rather than strategic reality was responsible for the Reich's collapse. On April 23, he dismissed Hermann Göring from his position as second-in-command via telegram, accusing him of treason. Days later, he ordered Heinrich Himmler's arrest after learning the SS leader had been secretly negotiating surrender terms with the Western Allies through intermediaries in neutral Sweden. But Morell was not spared Hitler's final fury either. Patient A had finally, catastrophically, lost his patience with his personal physician on the night of April 21, 1945. According to Morell's diary, he had approached Hitler that evening to administer what had become a routine glucose injection. Hitler was in a state of extreme agitation, pacing the bunker like a caged animal as Soviet artillery drew closer to the Chancellery. When Morell produced his syringe, Hitler exploded with a violence that shocked even the jaded observers in the bunker. He screamed that he knew Morell was drugging him with morphine, that the doctor had been poisoning him for years, that everything wrong with his health and his mind was Morell's fault. The dictator who had once trusted this man with his life now threatened to have him shot as a traitor. Morell, according to his own account, fell to his knees and pleaded with Hitler, protesting his innocence and his loyalty. But the Führer was beyond reason. He ordered Morell to leave immediately, to remove his military uniform, and never to return. After nearly 9 years of constant companionship, after thousands of injections and pills, after building a fortune on his proximity to power, Theodor Morell was banished forever from Hitler's presence. Morell left the bunker that night knowing he would never see patient A again. Hitler was by then a complete physical wreck. Other visitors in those final days described a man who could barely walk, whose hands shook uncontrollably, who looked decades older than his 56 years. The stimulants, the opiates, the tranquilizers, the bizarre cocktails of hormones and enzymes, they had all taken their toll. Whether Hitler continued taking whatever drugs Morell had left behind in his final 9 days before suicide on April 30th remains unknown, but the damage was already irreversible. Morell did not remain in Berlin to face capture by the Soviet forces closing in on the city. Like many Nazi officials, he managed to secure passage on one of the last flights out of the besieged capital. But unlike others who fled to the makeshift government forming at Flensburg near the Danish border, Morell had no political position to maintain. His dismissal by Hitler had left him without purpose or protection in the collapsing Reich. In the early hours of April 23, 1945, Morell's plane lifted off from Berlin and flew south over the advancing Soviet lines toward Munich. As they crossed into Bavaria, Russian soldiers on the ground gave way to American and British forces. The doctor who had spent nearly a decade at the center of Nazi power was about to become just another war criminal in Allied custody. Morell landed in Munich already seriously ill. The stress of his final confrontation with Hitler, combined with his deteriorating heart condition and general poor health, had pushed him to the edge of complete physical collapse. He was immediately hospitalized in Bad Reichenhall, where he lay bedridden when American forces overran the region in the first days of May 1945. On May 18, 1945, American soldiers finally came to question the man who had been Hitler's personal physician. What they found was a pathetic figure. Grossly obese, barely coherent, with hygiene so poor that interrogators could hardly stand to be in the same room with him. Morell's mind seemed as damaged as his body. He mumbled responses to questions, appearing confused about basic facts and unable to maintain focus for extended periods. Some interrogators suspected he was feigning mental illness to avoid prosecution, but medical examinations suggested genuine cognitive decline. The man who had once commanded the attention of kings and dictators, who had built a pharmaceutical empire worth millions, who had literally held the health of the Third Reich's leader in his hands, was now reduced to an incoherent shell of his former self. The Americans transferred Morell to Dachau concentration camp, which had been converted into an internment facility for suspected Nazi war criminals. Here he joined thousands of others awaiting investigation and potential prosecution for their roles in the Reich's crimes. But Morell's case presented unique challenges for Allied prosecutors. Unlike many other Nazi officials, Morell had held no formal government position. He was not a party leader, military commander, or administrator of genocide. His crimes, if they were crimes at all, were medical rather than political. How do you prosecute a doctor for malpractice when his patient was Adolf Hitler? How do you argue that enabling the Führer's drug dependency was somehow worse than the countless atrocities committed by others in the Nazi hierarchy? The legal framework simply didn't exist to address Morell's unique form of complicity. When the doctor's trial began in December 1946, prosecuting 23 physicians who had conducted horrific medical experiments in concentration camps, Morell was notably absent from the defendant's dock. His former rival, Karl Brandt, sat among the accused and would eventually be executed for his role in the Nazi euthanasia program. But there was no clear legal theory under which Morell's treatment of Hitler could be prosecuted as a war crime. Part of the reason for this prosecutorial restraint was Morell's obviously deteriorating condition. By 1946, he was clearly dying. His heart problems had worsened dramatically, and his mental faculties continued to decline. Prison doctors reported that he was often unresponsive and seemed to have only limited awareness of his surroundings. Prosecutors abandoned plans to have him testify in the doctor's trial, concluding that his testimony would be worthless given his mental state. Morell spent the final 3 years of his life being transferred between various prison hospitals and medical facilities. In summer 1947, he was moved to Tegernsee Hospital, where he would spend his remaining months. By then, he could barely communicate at all. Interviews with Allied investigators produced only incoherent mumbling and half-formed words. The man who had once held fascinating conversations with Hitler about medicine and health was now incapable of expressing the simplest thoughts. The end came on May 26, 1948. Theodor Morell died in his hospital bed at Tegernsee at the age of 61, just over 3 years after his dramatic banishment from Hitler's bunker. There were brief newspaper obituaries noting his role as Hitler's physician, but most contained significant inaccuracies. The full extent of his influence and the shocking details of his treatment methods would remain hidden for decades. Morell's death attracted little attention. He had no family present. His wife Johanna had distanced herself from him after the war and would outlive him by many years. There were no colleagues to mourn his passing, no patients to remember his treatments fondly. The man who had once been wealthy and powerful enough to treat heads of state died alone and forgotten, his body as broken as his reputation. But death did not end Morell's story. In the chaos of the war's end, his most valuable possession, the detailed diary of his treatment of patient A, had been buried in crates near Bad Reichenhall. For decades, these documents remained hidden, known only to a few researchers who lacked the resources to properly study them. It was only in the 1980s, nearly 40 years after the war's end, that Morell's diary was finally published and made available to historians. The revelations contained in these pages stunned the historical community. Here was documented proof that Adolf Hitler had been a drug addict, that his personal physician had enabled and fed this addiction for nearly a decade, and that many of the crucial decisions of World War II had been made by a leader under the influence of powerful narcotics. The implications were staggering and continue to be debated by historians today. Morell's diary entries, with their clinical detachment and meticulous record-keeping, provided an unprecedented window into the private health struggles of one of history's most destructive figures. Entry after entry documented the progressive deterioration of Hitler's physical and mental condition, the increasing frequency and potency of drug treatments, and the growing dependency that bound patient and doctor together in a relationship of mutual destruction. Reading these entries today, one is struck by Morell's apparent lack of self-awareness about what he was doing. He recorded Hitler's drug dependency with the same clinical objectivity he applied to blood pressure readings and vitamin injections. There is no indication in his writing that he understood he was chronicling the systematic destruction of his patient's health rather than its restoration. This blindness, whether willful or genuine, may be the most disturbing aspect of Morell's legacy. Here was a trained physician, educated at some of Germany's finest medical institutions, who either could not or would not recognize that his treatments were causing more harm than good. The same professional training that should have made him Hitler's healer instead made him his destroyer. The historical impact of this medical malpractice cannot be overstated. During some of the most critical moments of World War II, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Holocaust's implementation, the desperate final defense of the Reich, Adolf Hitler was making strategic decisions while under the influence of methamphetamines, opiates, and other powerful substances administered by Theodor Morell. Could different medical care have changed the course of history? The question haunts anyone who studies this period. Would a more ethical physician have refused to enable Hitler's dependency? Would clearer thinking have led to different military strategies? Might the war have ended sooner if Hitler had not been increasingly erratic and paranoid due to his pharmaceutical dependency? These counterfactual questions have no definitive answers, but they illustrate the profound responsibility that came with Morell's position. He was not just treating a patient. He was medicating the leader of a regime responsible for the deaths of millions. Every injection, every pill, every treatment decision potentially affected the lives of countless others. Yet Morell seems never to have grasped this larger responsibility. His diary entries focus obsessively on Hitler's immediate symptoms and his own prescribed treatments, with little apparent awareness of the broader context in which his medical decisions were being made. He was treating patient A, not Adolf Hitler, a psychological distance that may have allowed him to avoid confronting the full implications of his actions. This compartmentalization, the ability to focus on technical details while ignoring moral implications, is perhaps Morell's most troubling characteristic. It allowed him to maintain his self-image as a caring physician even while systematically destroying his patient's health. It enabled him to build a fortune selling drugs to the German military while convincing himself he was contributing to medical science. The pattern is recognizable in many professional contexts where technical expertise becomes divorced from ethical responsibility. The engineer who designs weapons systems without considering their ultimate use, the accountant who structures tax avoidance schemes without questioning their social impact, the scientist who conducts research without examining its potential applications, all share Morell's capacity for moral compartmentalization. This psychological mechanism allows individuals to participate in harmful systems while maintaining their personal sense of integrity. It is perhaps the most dangerous form of corruption because it is so difficult to recognize and resist. Unlike simple greed or malice, which can be easily identified and condemned, this form of ethical blindness often masquerades as professional dedication and technical competence. Morell's story serves as a warning about the dangers of divorcing professional expertise from moral responsibility. His medical knowledge made him valuable to Hitler, but his ethical blindness made him dangerous to everyone else. The same skills that could have made him a great healer instead made him an enabler of destruction. The legacy of Theodor Morell extends far beyond his personal relationship with Adolf Hitler. His story illuminates broader questions about professional ethics, moral responsibility, and the corrupting influence of power that remain relevant today. In an era when medical professionals face increasing pressure from patients demanding specific treatments, when pharmaceutical companies market directly to consumers, and when alternative medicine continues to challenge conventional therapeutic approaches, Morell's example provides important lessons about the dangers of abandoning professional standards in favor of patient preferences. His transformation from legitimate physician to enabler of addiction also offers insights into how corruption develops gradually through seemingly small compromises. Morell did not set out to become Hitler's drug dealer. He began with genuine attempts to help his patient, using innovative treatments that were sometimes ahead of their time. But each success led to greater trust, greater access, and greater temptation to maintain his privileged position through increasingly questionable means. The progression from vitamin injections to methamphetamine, from probiotics to opiates, from medical innovation to pharmaceutical enabling, happened one decision at a time. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, justified by the previous success and the patient's immediate relief. Only in retrospect does the full arc of corruption become apparent. This gradual nature of Morell's ethical decline makes his story particularly relevant for understanding how good people can become complicit in bad systems. He was not initially evil. His early medical training was legitimate, his innovative treatments sometimes effective, his concern for his patients apparently genuine. But his gradual drift from ethical standards, enabled by his patient's dependency and his own ambition, ultimately led him to become an active participant in one of history's most destructive regimes. The question that haunts Morell's story is whether his corruption was inevitable given the circumstances, or whether different choices at key moments could have led to different outcomes. Could he have maintained his ethical standards while treating Hitler? Could he have refused to prescribe increasingly dangerous substances? Could he have used his influence to encourage better decision-making rather than enabling destructive behavior? These questions have no easy answers, but they illuminate the moral choices that all professionals face when dealing with powerful, demanding clients. The pressure to provide what is requested rather than what is needed, to maintain relationships rather than uphold standards, to prioritize immediate relief over long-term welfare. These temptations are not unique to Nazi Germany or 1940s medicine. Morell's failure to resist these pressures serves as a cautionary tale for anyone whose professional expertise gives them influence over others' lives. His story demonstrates how quickly the line between healing and harming can be crossed when ethical constraints are gradually abandoned in favor of personal advancement. The most chilling aspect of Morell's legacy may be how ordinary his corruption was in its mechanisms, even if extraordinary in its consequences. The psychological processes that led him from healer to enabler, rationalization, compartmentalization, gradual ethical drift, addiction to proximity to power, are recognizable in many contexts and many professions. Understanding these processes is crucial for recognizing and resisting similar corruptions in our own time. Morell's story is not just a historical curiosity, but a contemporary warning about the eternal human capacity for turning healing into harm when professional ethics are subordinated to personal ambition. His life reminds us that the most dangerous forms of corruption are often those that develop gradually, justified by good intentions and enabled by small compromises. The choice between being a healer or an enabler is rarely dramatic or obvious. More often, it emerges through countless small decisions, each seeming reasonable in isolation, but collectively leading toward moral disaster. Theodor Morell's transformation from village schoolteacher's son to Hitler's drug dealer happened one choice at a time, one compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time. Understanding how it happened to him helps us understand how it could happen to any of us, and why vigilance about professional ethics is not just a personal responsibility, but a social necessity. The final irony of Morell's story is that he achieved the immortality he sought through his association with power, but not in the way he intended. Instead of being remembered as an innovative physician or successful businessman, he is known primarily as an enabler of evil, a man whose medical malpractice may have influenced the course of world history. This legacy serves as a sobering reminder that we are ultimately defined not by our intentions, but by our actions, not by our aspirations, but by our choices, not by what we meant to do, but by what we actually did. Morell may have seen himself as a healer until the very end, but history remembers him as a destroyer. His story asks us to examine our own professional lives for the seeds of similar corruption, to recognize the warning signs of ethical drift before they lead us too far from our principles. It challenges us to consider what kind of legacy we want to leave, and whether we have the courage to make the difficult choices that lead to a reputation we can be proud of. Because in the end, the story of Theodor Morell is not just about one man's fall from grace. but about the eternal human struggle between professional integrity and personal ambition, between ethical responsibility and the corrupting influence of power, between the choice to heal and the temptation to harm.